Hello everybody, Dr. Dave here. Welcome to Tipsy Vervet. The purpose of our podcast is to help people make sense of life and create meaning. Well, what we talk about is based on our own experiences with addiction and helping other people who are overcoming addiction. The principles that we share are universal, and we think they'll be helpful to anyone who aims to better understand themselves and who wants to cultivate a life that's worth living, regardless of what their past experiences might be.
I'm Pierre, and I've been involved in the addiction community for over a decade. This podcast is independent of any other work we do, and we're in no way affiliated with anyone else. We hope that the spirit that comes across in our conversations is one of compassion, and that you find it helpful.
Tipsy Vervet.
Hello, and welcome to the podcast. I'm here with my good friend David.
Okay,
What are we going to talk about today?
let's talk about addiction. I think that we get a good sense of what we mean by it, and hopefully people will relate to that. And it's important, I think, to define what addiction is, because we use the term so loosely, don't we? I'm addicted to chocolate. I'm addicted to playing tennis. And I think that it in a way, it cheapens the word and it diminishes what is actually a really significant problem, actually. So if I can just draw this, if we have a look at, if this represents people who drink alcohol, yeah, a proportion of those people may drink an excessive amount, and so we would call these heavy drinkers, right? And some of those people will drink sufficient amount that it actually becomes hazardous to their health and their behavior and their relationships. So we would call this hazardous drinking or problem drinking. Now, this is important because these people present themselves in the same way that addicts would present, because they're drinking huge amounts of alcohol, and it's hazardous because it has the potential to damage health, to interfere with relationships, to interfere with their work, accidents and things like that, legal issues. And despite that, they continue to drink. And what happens is that you become physically dependent on alcohol. You know, if you take any, and we see this even with normal medicines, right? If you take anything in excessive amounts for a sufficient period of time, your body gets used to it. And in doing so, it stops producing the natural chemicals that your body would normally produce, that the medication or the drug that you're taking is mimicking, right? And so what happens is when you try and stop drinking or stop taking that medication, you get withdrawal effects. And that makes it very difficult to stop. And so what happens is these people who are, well, I call them chronic heavy drinkers, right? Chronic meaning that it's for a prolonged period of time. And heavy drinkers, they're drinking too much. They become physically dependent, and it's quite difficult to stop. However, if they're given sufficient reason to stop, so their doctor warns them that their health has suffered or the relationships are falling apart, and those relationships are important to them, there's a threat of losing their work, or they're threatened with legal issues. So if they're given sufficient reason to stop, and sufficient help, and this is very important, right? Because you need help to get over those physical withdrawals, then those people can stop. And if they have sufficient reason, then they can stay abstinent from substances. Or in fact, for some of them, once they're over the physical withdrawals, they can actually just cut down and return to what I would call normal drinking rate, this typically. and they can actually cut down. However, there's a small proportion of people down here who have a lot more trouble stopping, and those were the people that I would term addicts. And they continue to use despite all of these negative consequences. And this is what, when in the AA text, they refer to it as being an insanity, right? So I drink today, I crash the car, my wife's angry with me and my liver's failing. And I think to myself, I need to stop. But tomorrow, by 9 o'clock in the morning, drinking time, and I continue to do it regardless of all of the consequences. And so these people have a lot more trouble stopping, even with help. And one of the problems is, even when they do stop and they become abstinent, they have an ongoing risk of going back to it, especially things that we know are particularly triggering, right? Particularly two things: emotions and other substances. So we know for a real addict, a person who is truly addicted to alcohol, if they just basically sniff the bottle, right, it becomes a drinking spree. And one sip is 2 bottles later, and you just don't know what's happened. So these people can't cut down, and they have enormous trouble stopping. And if they do stop, they have trouble staying abstinent. And so these are the people I would refer to as addicts. I mean, not everybody agrees with this definition. This is the way we relate to it, right? Yeah. I think this is a very important definition, though, because if you have a look at this diagram, the vast majority of people who drink too much are not addicts. And so these are the people that doctors would see, right? When somebody goes to them and says, or goes to rehab even, and says, I'm drinking too much, I need help to stop. And you assist them to stop. And when they stop, they're able either to continue at a lower rate, to cut down. Or, and I meet a lot of people like that, right? You say to me, I've had an alcohol problem. And I say to them, well, what happened? And they said, no, it was a problem, so I stopped. And I always think that's quite remarkable and very admirable, right? For an addict, it just is not possible. And so there's something different about that person's brain to the person who can stop. And so when doctors see these people who are heavy chronic drinkers and they assist them to stop or assist them to cut down, and then they see somebody who's an addict and that person can't stop, or if they do stop, they have trouble staying abstinent and they keep going back to it. So people refer to having relapses, right? I hate that word because what's a relapse? What does it really mean? What we mean by a relapse actually is a return to drinking after a period of abstinence, actually. But that doesn't tell you anything about how long the period of abstinence was or how long the period of drinking that comes after that abstinence is. So when doctors and other people, family and the community sees people who have trouble staying abstinent, it's so easy to judge them and to say that they're weak-willed or they're not trying hard enough, because we compare them to people who can stop. And so it can be incredibly demoralizing, when everyone's continually angry with you. The thing about addiction, of course, is that in active drinking, when you're drinking too much or you're taking other drugs, your behavior is erratic, you're irresponsible, you're often dishonest, right, to get around. You lie, you don't meet your responsibilities, you have trouble fulfilling your commitments, and very often your behavior is dangerous to yourself and other people. And so a lot of the time, one of the reasons that the medical profession, I think, and insurers talk about addiction being a disease is because there's sort of a concept that if we label something as a disease, then people will be more sympathetic to it, right? And we can reduce the stigma. But you're not going to reduce the stigma about addiction, because addicts in active addiction, be very careful, right? Addicts in active addiction are not nice people. They're dangerous. They're dishonest. They don't fulfill their commitments. And so that plays into this sort of sense, right, that somebody's weak-willed, they're not trying hard enough, and it can be very demoralizing both for the people around them, community, and for the person with addiction themselves. And so I think it's important to understand what's actually happening with somebody who's addicted, and to be very clear that they are not the same as those other people who have been using a lot of alcohol and have been able to stop.
Right.
So maybe we should have a look and see what's actually happening, right?
Let's.
So let's turn the old page here. So let's just draw a brain. This is a brain, right? This is the front of the brain. This is the back of the brain, and we're looking side on the right side of the head. But this is not to scale, right?
Yeah.
Right. Now at the front of the brain here, this part of the brain here, this is the part of the brain where we think from, when we purposefully think. And inside the brain here, deeper within the brain, this part of the brain is responsible for our lower levels of consciousness, right? Our levels of consciousness that are below our levels of awareness. So this is where emotions arise, where memories are formed, where you find things beautiful, where you get an affinity to other people, right? This is where most of your thoughts arise actually during the day, because mind wandering is here. And we spend most of our day actually in mind wandering, and very importantly, and we'll talk about this on another day, but you don't choose most of your thoughts. Your thoughts just arise, right? You can choose your thoughts, and you can choose to turn your attention to thoughts and to other things, but for most of the day, actually, you don't choose your thoughts, they just arise. And that's very important, and that's a whole subject on its own. So this part of the brain here, there's parts of the brain, and these lower levels of consciousness, below our levels of awareness, they're connected to our thinking brain. And so we can pay attention to what's happening there if we choose to, but a lot of the time we don't pay attention to it. And in fact, it drives our behavior, right? Because we don't choose our thoughts. You don't choose to feel emotions. You just feel those emotions, and you feel the feeling associated with that emotion, which is important, right? The feeling associated with an emotion. And what I mean by a feeling is that emotions are associated with thoughts and bodily sensations. And so these are connected. So we often think that, in fact, our thinking part of our brain will regulate our emotions and they can do to some extent. But in fact, what happens in reality is completely the opposite, that our low levels of awareness control our thinking brain, and our thinking brain just validates what's happening in this part of the brain. That's why so many people are actually slaves to their emotion and their initial impressions of things, right? I mean, if you we meet people like who claim to have anger issues, right? Basically what they're just saying is, I behave like a child when something annoys me. And what's happening there is they're not allowing this active thinking part of their brain to regulate their behavior when they feel these strong emotions. Then that's what they're really saying, right? I feel really strong emotions, and before I act, I don't think. And so I act impulsively, which is also in this part of the brain here. And when I act impulsively and I don't think about how I'm going to act, and the outcome is often less helpful than it could have been. Yeah. So this is very important, because what we notice in addiction is that when we first use alcohol or other substances, right, it initially feels good. And what happens is, when it feels good, this part of the brain here is activated, and when it feels good, danger. When it feels good, we learn that it feels good, and that when we feel strong emotions, or when we're not feeling so good, then we've learned that by taking this substance, we feel good. And so what happens is, subconsciously, when I'm feeling uncomfortable for any reason, I will automatically reach out and find something to make me feel more comfortable. And so what happens is, we find that initially, when I start using substances, my use is impulsive. In other words, when I have a reason to want to feel good, I will impulsively reach out and take a drink. Impulsively means that I do it without any thought for future consequences. Even though I know that last time I drank too much and the consequences were bad, I will impulsively reach out to make myself feel better because it feels good. The problem with using substances is, after a while, especially as my body gets used to it, and I have these periods in between where I'm not feeling as good as how I felt while I was drinking, I start to feel bad in between. So now what happens is, when I start using alcohol, I start using it because I get this positive reinforcement. It makes me feel good. But after a while, in between, I start to feel bad. So now I start using it because I'm having a negative reinforcement, right? Initially, I use it to feel good. Now I'm using it perhaps to feel good, but also to not feel so bad. You know? And we all know that the more we use it and the longer we use it, after a while, we don't feel so good anymore. We just feel bad all the time. So it starts off, we do it because we feel good. Then we feel good, and in between we feel bad. And after a while, we just feel bad all the time. And now it changes from being impulsive to compulsive. In other words, I have to do it. I have to do it just to try and avoid feeling so bad. Now, in this area of the brain here, there's a pathway. So we all hear about dopamine all the time, right? Dopamine. And I was thinking to myself, dopamine is important, but it's like saying, and here we're sort of like glibly dividing the brain up into different parts, right? And it's like saying, my car drives because it's got an engine. Well, if you just had the engine, it wouldn't go anywhere, right? You need the rest of the car and the wheels and the steering wheel and the driver and all the petrol and so everything works together, and it's the same with the brain. So it's very sort of trite to divide the brain up into different areas because it all works together. But nevertheless, so we hear about dopamine being very important in addiction, and people often talk about, they sort of imply that behaviors and foods and things like that are addictive because they feed into the same pathways, the same dopamine pathways that drugs of abuse fit into. And that's like saying, I use my legs to walk to Durban, and I use my legs to play basketball. Therefore, if I play basketball, I end up in Durban, right? Because they both involve my legs. It's everything fits into the dopamine pathways because the dopamine pathways are important for a number of things. Firstly, they are not the pathways that make you feel good. When you drink, you feel good because alcohol affects many areas of the brain. Importantly, your natural endorphins, your natural, the same sort of receptors that cannabis interacts with, and various other neurotransmitters in the brain, like gamma-aminobutyric acid, which is your neurotransmitter that tones you down a bit and removes anxiety, and it sort of like dampens down the activity of the brain, and it reduces other neurotransmitters like glutamate, which which is your excitatory neurotransmitter, right? So what happens is alcohol makes you feel good from that point of view initially. After a while, as we were saying, the feeling of goodness wears off because all of these chemicals and the places where they act in the brain are turned down. So that's why one of the reasons why you need to take more and more alcohol to actually get the same sort of feeling. And after a while, the good feeling disappears altogether. And you've disrupted your chemicals and the receptors that they act on so much that you just feel bad all the time, especially if you don't keep topping the alcohol up, right? But what happens is what the dopamine system does. So we often refer to this as the reward pathways in the brain. And in fact, they're not the reward pathways in the brain. Because as I mentioned, the reward feeling of alcohol comes from its other effects that it has. These pathways are actually the reward-seeking pathways of the brain. And pretty much everything feeds into them, right? I mean, this is what drives you to put a jersey on when you're feeling cold, and to eat something when you're hungry, or drink something when you're thirsty. They're activated when you get a hug from somebody, you know? It pretty much everything feeds in here. And that's why to say something, just because something feeds in here, it's addictive. It's just not true at all. But what the dopamine does, and these pathways do, they do three very, very important things. So they are involved in attention. So they turn your attention to what your brain thinks your body needs. They're involved in motivation. They motivate you to seek that thing out. And very importantly, they're involved in learning. And so you can see what's actually happening here in addiction. All drugs of addiction, in different ways and to different extents, but they activate these reward-seeking pathways. Now, if you think about what is involved in addiction, as we mentioned just now, if I take a substance and I feel better and it helps dampen down my difficult emotions, it helps lubricate me in social situations so that I don't feel so uncomfortable with other people, I will learn that alcohol does this for me, that alcohol makes me feel more comfortable. And what happens is, when I'm reminded of what alcohol can do for me, so, for example, when I feel strong emotions that are uncomfortable, or I have to go into a social situation where I have to interact with other people, because my brain has learned that alcohol helps me, I'm automatically reminded that alcohol will help me again. And so what it does is it turns my attention. This is, of course, I'm not aware that this is happening, right? It turns my attention to what my body needs, and my body needs alcohol. It motivates me to seek it. And it's involved in learning. So one of the things that happens in addiction is that anything that reminds me of drinking makes me want to drink. And in the rehab scenario, we often talk about, well, what reminds me of drinking, right? People, places, and things. Have you heard this? People, places, and things. And I say that people, places, and things. What else is there? Right? So I always think to myself, what reminds me of drinking? Well, I used to drink when I was on my own, but I used to drink when I was with other people. I used to drink when I was working and when I had nothing to do. I used to drink in front of the TV. I used to drink when I was thinking about going somewhere. I used to drink when I was eating. Then when I wasn't eating, I used to drink when I was cooking. Right? So what reminds me of drinking? Everything. Everything reminds me of drinking. The problem is I don't even know when my brain is being reminded of drinking. But when my brain is reminded of drinking, I automatically turns my attention to what my body needs. It motivates me to seek it out. And I'm not even aware of this. So this is when we talk about the impulsivity of drinking, this is one of the things that's driving the impulsivity of thinking. Now, importantly, this pattern of activity has got a name. And the reason that I point this out is because I want people to understand that we know what's happening in people's brains that are addicted. And we've got names for what's happening there. I want people to understand you're not using because you're a useless crackhead, you're just a drunk. You're using because you're suffering from addiction. And I use that word very purposefully, right? Because we suffer, despite the fact it looks like we're selfish and irresponsible. We're suffering from addiction. So what do we call this? When my brain is reminded of using, we call this incentive salience. Now, what this means is something that's salient is something that stands out. So a white car in a group of red cars would be a salient car. Salient point in an argument, like to help you win the argument, right? It stands out. So something that stands out to my consciousness. Yeah? Incentive means it drives me to want to do something. So incentive salience refers to something that stands out that drives my brain to want to drink. And when we identify what those things are, and people are invited when they're trying to or trying to maintain abstinence to identify triggers, right? We call these triggers that increase me wanting to drink. And when you write down what your triggers are, you basically write down a list of what happens in your everyday life all day, right? Relationships, emotions, having to work, not having enough work to do, eating, not eating, watching TV. That's why people say, when you want to drink, take your mind off it, Go and watch a movie. What's the first thing they do in a movie? They pour a drink, right? Only a non-addict would say that to an addict. It's like saying just don't have one more. Once you started, you're sort of locked in. We'll talk about that in a sec. The trick here is to recognize that pretty much everything triggers this desire to drink, and very often we're not even aware of it. So one of the things that we're going to do moving forward to maintain abstinence is to recognize that we need a constant vigilance against it. So I'm not talking about a constant daily battle to stay sober or to stay abstinent. I'm talking about a constant vigilance against slip. Because we know that if I slip just one sip, and I'm at 2 bottles in within an hour, like an hour and a half. So that's the first important thing that's happening, is to recognize. And I think that for many people, this is not everybody's experience. I mean, you and I have had different experiences. For many addicts, though, this incentive salience, this risk of returning to it, is lifelong. And one of the commonest things that we hear when we go to meetings, addiction meetings, of people who have had a period of abstinence but then have returned to drinking or using drugs, the thing they say is, I checked my eye off it, I stopped working program, right? What they're saying is that I became complacent, right? So I think that it's important to understand that. Now, what happens, at least initially anyway, when you use alcohol or other substances, you get this, in the reward-seeking pathways of the brain, you get this spike of dopamine, which is followed by a slight dip in dopamine. And as I mentioned to you, what this does here is it turns your attention to what you need, motivates you to seek it out, and it's involved in learning. Now, this is important for a number of reasons, right? Because if you have a look at dopamine, and we're saying that pretty much everything feeds into those reward pathways, right? So let me draw this in another color here. So this is what dopamine would look like, right? Here's my levels of dopamine. There's always some dopamine being released, but I have a cheese sandwich that's quite nice. There's a spike in dopamine. Now remember that was delicious. I'll have another one. I put some tomato in it next time, slightly bigger. Spike dopamine. Have some sex. That's quite nice too, right? Have some sex after marriage. It's a joke. Have some crack. Right? Now, nothing will take you up there to where crack can take, right? And so this is one of the reasons that you lose all motivation to do these other things that used to bring you pleasure. So nothing can take you there. Also, you get completely dependent on it. And so one of the things that we find in addiction is that we lose motivation to do the things that would normally afford us pleasure. And we become completely fixated on drinking and using drugs, which is very puzzling for people. Now, one of the ways that the brain works is it doesn't actually respond to what's happening around it per se. It predicts what's going to happen next. It just can't work quickly enough to respond to everything that's happening around it. And so what happens is, as we learn that alcohol brings us a respite from the difficulties of daily life, our brain predicts that next time we drink, we're going to feel the same thing. And this is part of incentive salience, of course. And what happens is, initially, when alcohol relieves the burden of everyday life, our brain predicts that it will do it again next time. But as we progress in our drinking over a period of months to years, what happens is it doesn't relieve that burden anymore. In fact, it just makes us feel bad all the time. But it's such a powerful substance that the brain has learned and continues to predict that will make me feel better. And that's got a name too. So this prediction that we're going to get a reward is part of this reward-seeking pathway, right? So dopamine is involved in that. And what's happening is our brain is predicting we're going to get a reward. And we call that a dopamine reward prediction. Now, actually, the reward doesn't necessarily mean that we will feel good necessarily. When we talk about a reward, we mean some sort of outcome. The problem is, what's happening is, although our brain is predicting we'll feel better, we don't feel better. And so the prediction is wrong. So it's an error. What's happening is a chain of events that we call dopamine reward prediction error. Dopamine reward prediction error. Now, the learning is so strong that even though I don't feel better, and in a normal brain, what would happen is, because of the error, your brain would update the prediction. In other words, didn't make me feel better, so stop it. In addiction, those mechanisms are damaged. And what the brain says is, it didn't make you feel better, try again, try harder. And so incentive salience is what causes you to not be able to stay abstinent and to leave it alone, say for a day or two or a week. Dopamine reward prediction error is the reason why when you start drinking, you can't stop. So I think, to talk about these things, for me, they're really important. But I want people to understand there's something going on in the brain that differentiates people who are what we would refer to as true addicts to other people who are chronic heavy drinkers who have an easier time staying abstinent. And the reason it's important to understand this is because it's not impossible to become abstinent if you're an addict. And all of these people look the same, right, in active drinking. I mean, if you go to an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, it's a very large heterogeneous group of people. In other words, a very large group of people, all of whom, or many of whom, are different from each other. And so some of my friends, they think that making a distinction of addicts is not necessary. So one of the psychologists that I respect greatly, he says it's not important. Are you dependent on alcohol? And would you like to become independent on alcohol? Because we can help you do those things. So he talks about people who are dependent and independent. I think that it's important to make this distinction because it helps people to understand that they are having more trouble, and for want of a better word, it's okay. It's okay. One thing, when we understand what's going on and we get a perspective of it, it helps to guide how we're going to overcome this thing. Now, one of the problems with this learning in the brain is that this learning in the brain and these mechanisms that we've spoken about, incentive, salience, dopamine, reward, prediction, error, if I can see my life falling apart, then the thinking part of my brain wants to stop. I want to stop. I want to. The problem is, this part of the brain here has learned that this is how I cope with a difficult life, and this part of the brain doesn't want to stop. And so this is how a brain works, by the way. You can have completely opposing concepts and thoughts in your brain at the same time. But your brain has to make sense of that. And so what's happening here, and we often see people, especially in the rehab scenario like this, like, I've heard that people say, if you don't want to stop for yourself, then you might as well get up and leave. Not going to work. And of course, what a cruel thing to say to anybody. It's absolute nonsense. And one of the reasons it's nonsense is because most of us don't want to stop. Even if we do want to stop, we don't want to stop. Inside this, and as I mentioned before, this powerful part of the brain, which has much more of an influence over our thoughts and the way we behave for most people than this thinking part of the brain. And even though we've got these connections between the two, in addiction, these pathways are damaged. And in fact, for many people, they never developed properly in the first place, which is, we can talk about this another time, maybe one of the reasons why we turn to addiction in the first place, to substances. But what's happening here is we've got these two opposing thoughts in our head at the same time. I don't want to stop, but I do want to stop. And so the brain has to make sense of this. And the way it makes sense of this is to create a new thought. I want to stop. I don't want to stop. How do I make sense of that? I can't stop. And so this in itself actually helps to justify not stopping. So what I want people to understand is that if you believe that you can't stop, it doesn't mean you can't stop. It's okay. That's how the brain works. It doesn't mean you can't stop. It means you're a normal human being and your brain is working, right? There are other things that feed into this, of course. If I've tried before and I haven't been successful, so previous tries, if I'm afraid of trying, in case I fail, so a fear of failure, maybe that's the wrong word. Let's not use that word, right? I'm afraid of trying because I think that I might not be successful at remaining abstinent. And for many of us, the actual story of our journey is trying to maintain abstinence, is to have these returns, what people refer to as a relapse. I don't like that word, but we have these returns to drinking in our attempt to stay abstinent. That's the natural history of addiction, and it's okay. It doesn't mean you won't be able to achieve sustained abstinence. What it can be, of course, is a complete disaster, because bad things happen when you're drunk, right? So we want to guard against that at every fiber of our being. It's not okay to return to drinking. But if you've returned to drinking, it's okay. It happens. Let's get back on the journey. And that's another thing I want people to understand about addiction, because there's a potential that if I have a slip, if I'm trying to maintain abstinence and I find myself that I've returned to it, the guilt and the shame can be intolerable and lock us back into just a cycle of trying to relieve these hideous emotions. Bearing in mind that there's no good or bad emotions, right? The reason we feel guilt and shame is because our body's trying to tell us something. Our body's trying to say, hey, you know what? You were abstinent for a while. You were doing so well. You know, what's happened? That's what it's trying to tell you. And so they're actually very functional and healthy and helpful emotions if they motivate you to get back on the journey,
Change behavior.
of abstinence. If, however, we allow them to pull us down, sink us into this ruminating thinking that I'm no good and can't do anything right, I'm always letting everybody down, I was abstinent for a while, I can't stay abstinent, there's nothing I can do about it, my life's hopeless, might as well kill myself. You know, this is where our thoughts turn to. Then it's not helpful. So I want people to understand that it's not okay if it happens, but if it happens, it's okay. Let's get back on the journey. And for many of us, we've had this experience, right? It's part of our story. And I do think if you've been to rehab 16 times, you do need to, you need to say, hey, what's not working, right? When I say that if it's happened, it's okay, it doesn't mean that what you've been doing is okay, because something has not been helpful enough to maintain that abstinence. So we do need to turn and say, hey, what have we been doing? What's been helpful? What was it that caused me to slip? What was it that caused me to take my attention away from it, that allowed it to happen? What could I start doing that I'm not doing? What could I stop doing that I've been doing that's not helping me? So it's not that we don't turn and say, hey, what happened here? What we do is we get back on the journey. If you fall off the horse, you get back on, right? You fail grade 6, you don't get back to grade 2. You say, hey, what do I need to learn? And you keep going forward, right? So it's never too late. And if you feel like you can't stop, if you are afraid of failure, it's okay. It's okay. Let's carry on. It is possible to become abstinent and retain that abstinence, maintain that abstinence. It does require constant vigilance, and it does require a lifestyle of implementing what we haven't learned that has enabled us to stay abstinent or to find meaning in life or to have a life that's worth living. And that is the solution, of course, to remaining abstinent, is to find a life that's worth living, where it doesn't mean that I won't feel like drinking. What it means is that I don't have to drink.
Lovely. Wow, you summed that up really, really well. I think the only thing that I wanted to just discuss briefly was the learning aspect that we spoke about. So, you know that old analogy of the skier on the mountain in the powdered snow. And the first time the skier goes down a path carved, and the second time the next skier that goes down is going to follow a lot of those grooves because there's a path already formed. By the 1,000th skier, that path is completely formed and it's impossible to go any other way. So too neural pathways. So, and I speak from experience, it was incredibly important for me to stay on the journey for a long enough time that the new pathways that I was trying to develop, or the new way of living, or the new way of learning, was reinforced on such a regular basis that then became the, if there's such a thing as the dominant path, but you know, the better way to be facing these things, certainly for me. And the important takeaway here was I had to stay on the journey long enough for that to have occurred.
Right. What you're saying is extremely important, because people say to me, oh, I've got to unlearn old habits. Of course, that's nonsense. You can't unlearn something. I mean, if you watch Alien, you're going to lie awake at night. You can't unwatch Alien. You're not going to not be afraid because I've decided to unlearn being terrified of alien. What you're saying is absolutely right. We're not unlearning things. We are learning new ways of thinking. And how do you learn something? This is really important, right? First of all, you learn something by doing it, and practice by doing it repetitively over and over and over. And if you want to learn to do something, spend your time with other people who are doing it. If you want to learn a language, what do? You speak it, and you spend your time with other people who are speaking it. The best way to learn Spanish is to go and stay in Spain, right? There are 3 elements to learning something, though, that I think are really important, which you also raised this thing. The first thing is I need to know what to do, right? That would require me to spend some time with people who could teach me. I need to believe I can do it. Now, especially in addiction, and we were talking about this sort of sense that I can't stop, that in itself expresses an unbelief, right? A completely opposite belief. I believe I can't stop. So that means that it's an absence of believing that I can stop. So if I'm going to believe that I can stop, I need to experience abstinence. So knowing means that I need to have people to teach me. Believing that I can is in itself is learned. I need the experience to believe that I can do it. And that's why I love the rehab model, right? Because what it does is it gives you 4 to 6 weeks of being abstinent to experience abstinence. And you can start developing this belief that I can do it. But there's a third thing that's required for learning. I need to believe that it's worth it. I mean, if I don't believe it's worth being abstinent, I don't think it's impossible to become abstinent, but I do think it's easier if you have a reason to. Now, one of the problems with addiction is that my life falls apart. My relationships are bad. My emotions are up and down all over the place. My work is suffering. I might have legal issues. And it just fuels itself, right? Because life is chaotic and unpleasant. So I might as well drink. What I need to do is I need to become abstinent, to experience what it's like to be abstinent, and to see how my life improves. And that, of course, removes many of the reasons why I drink. It doesn't take away the desire to drink, right? What it does is it takes away some of the reasons to dampen down. It takes away some of the difficulties of life, right, that I want to run away from. So to believe that it's worth it, I often have to experience it. So knowing what to do in itself is not enough. You've got to embark on a journey of doing it. First of all, to believe, to see that you can. Secondly, to see the difference that it makes in your life and to believe that it's worth it, to pursue that path in the face of not necessarily wanting to, right? Because those subconscious, I don't want to stop, for many of us that remains. Where I can be abstinent, and when I feel strong emotions, I still have this desire to drink. In abstinence and in this knowing what to do and believing you can, one of the things is to be aware of it and to recognize it when it happens. So you and I have had different experiences, and I'm sure we'll talk about this. But for me, the desire to drink has never left me. And it's that I know what to do with it now, and that I believe that it's worth doing something about. Yeah.
I think that's really, really, really well summed up. That's...
Let's talk about...
I could identify with every single aspect of that, but yes, go ahead.
Sorry, I was interrupted.
No, not at all.
I just wanted to mention something else that's important because, we talk about addiction, people don't always like the labels. And I do hear people say to people who refer to themselves as an addict, don't label yourself. Stop it, right? You're just making something and keeping something going. When people ask me, are you an addict? Are you an addict in recovery? You're a recovered addict. And I hate this word recovery, by the way. It's another whole subject. I'm none of those things. What I am is I'm a normal person as long as I don't drink.
Right.
And being a normal person has all the privileges of being a normal person. That means that I experience life like any other normal person. It has its ups and downs. The lovely thing about being a normal person who is abstinent from past life is that the pathway to abstinence involves cultivating wisdom. And so I think we talk about the gifts of addiction, right? One of the gifts of addiction is that many people use different behaviors to manage a difficult life. They climb the corporate ladder, they chase after materialistic positions, they have serial relationships that fail. The lovely thing about being an addict is your life becomes so dysfunctional that you're forced to turn and face what it means to be a human being. So when I go to a meeting, I do refer to myself as an alcoholic or an addict, not in recovery, because I'm not in recovery. I'm a normal person, right? As long as I don't drink. The reason I refer to myself as an addict is for two reasons. The first reason is because it's appropriate at that meeting for the other people, because by introducing myself as somebody who's experienced what they are experiencing or have experienced themselves, they know they can talk to me. I mean, we discuss things with other addicts and at the rehabs we go to that we wouldn't discuss outside of those situations with other people because they wouldn't understand what we're talking about. So when I introduce myself as an addict at a meeting, it's for the people there so they know we have shared a particular journey and that we can talk and be very open with each other without feeling judged. The second reason is what I was referring to earlier. It's for myself. I know that I'm just one sip away from slipping back into oblivion. And so, this is a cliche, which I hate cliches and memes. I know you do too, but I'm going to repeat one. It's the most important thing I have to do today is to not drink. And I think that, that's it's not a question of being obsessed with it. It's a question I know through experience that if I go back to it, it will become a problem again.
Yeah.
So and we meet lots of people like this, right, who've been abstinent for sometimes years, and all of a sudden they find themselves back into it, and they say, "I don't know what happened. All I know is that I took my attention away from it."
Mm.
And so it's not a question of labeling yourself. I mean, nobody complains because people with diabetes label themselves. They know that they have to take their medication every day, otherwise they will die. And so it's not labeling yourself to maintain a condition top of mind that has the potential to kill you. Difference between us and a diabetic, of course, is as long as we don't drink, we're not bound to medication generally,
Right. Lovely and a wonderful summary as well. What's on the menu for the next episode?
Wait and see.
Thank you very much for tuning in. We'll post some info in the bio as normal. And please like and subscribe. And we'll see you next time. Thank you, David.
Thanks. Bye-bye.